How likely do you think it is that President Zelenskyy was involved?
The last thing I could think of is him being messing around this thing. We have learned our lesson, because this was not only about Yermak. This were like two members of the government and one other former member of the government whose names are being part of that. And it also gave us the lesson that even when the war is raging on, you cannot turn a blind eye on things which are happening in any area. Now the instructions from president to the government is just to have a full control of the situation, making sure that all the commitments and expectations of people are met. And we will see how that works.
The silver lining in that corruption scandal is that the independent anti-corruption body is the organization that was able to dig out the scandal that we're seeing. So that's a positive development there. Madam Ambassador, pleasure to speak to you again. I appreciate your time. I know there's a meeting going on right now in the US, and we've also had the meetings that happened in Russia. So there's a lot going on, and there's a lot that happened since we last spoke. So I appreciate your time.
Hello, Maria. Indeed, things are changing every hour, I would say, and I appreciate your attention to this point.
So I want to start with just a few of the latest developments that happened in the last couple of days. So President Putin said, quote, "We'll take Donbas by force or by surrender." And that was right after the discussions with Witkoff and Kushner. So it wasn't that positive of a comment to make. And that was after the comments by NATO that they're looking at preemptively responding to the Russian hybrid warfare that we've seen. We also have Macron in China. One of the many things they've discussed is the Ukraine war. And obviously China's, to a large extent, financing the war for Russia. So let's start with getting your thoughts on these developments. The comments by Putin after the meeting between the Russian and the American delegation. And at the same time as that, so I'm giving you a lot of information to get your thoughts on everything. At the same time as that, we had a representative from China meeting Lavrov at the exact same time. So my first question to you is, what do you make of all these developments from Putin's comments, not too positive, Trump's comments, Putin wants to end the Ukraine war, the meetings in Russia with the US and with China, and obviously NATO's comments about a preemptive response to Russia's hybrid warfare?
Well, I think the signal Putin was sending, he was sending it first and foremost to American delegation, basically playing with his muscles, saying that he's like a rock solid in his intentions, and nothing, no action could really force him to consider that that the war should be over. And I think this was the bottom line, and we are going only to have the meeting between Ukrainian head of delegation Rustem Umerov and special envoy Witkoff to hear the full readout. But from what we understand, that not much progress was reached after this meeting.
What about the Macron's in China now? And also China had a representative meet Lavrov at the same time as the US delegation was meeting the Russian delegation. What message do you get from China with all these meetings and the comments they've been making recently? Do you think they are also seeking an end to the war, or they don't mind continuing to finance Russia to keep the US distracted from, let's say, Taiwan?
We do not receive, as Ukraine, a lot of messages from China. China has its dialogue with Russia and with the United States and with European allies. But at the same time, I think it's absolutely makes sense that the Chinese representative is in Moscow the same time when the American delegation has been, because basically when the full-scale invasion started, when Russia started its aggression, it was China who gave a backup to Russia in terms of the components, in terms of the financial flows, in terms of investments into the Russian economy. China was there, and they, as you remember, there was a meeting between Putin and Xi Jinping, sealing this 1,000-year historical partnership. And right after the political changes in the United States, President Putin turns a blind eye on all of it and just have this meeting with the American president in Alaska and changes the whole narrative. his narrative before that this is a war against NATO, against aggressive West, United States. This is the narrative he has been pouring inside of this country, but also outside of his allies, and it's been changed. So to avoid this unpredictable developments, I think it's purely natural that the watchdog from China is deployed to Moscow for these days.
You also said there's no progress at the meeting between Ritkov and the Russian delegation and Putin. Though, if there's no progress, what do you think they talked about for 5 hours? How can you not have progress over 5 hours? I understand in Alaska it was a much shorter meeting, but that was a long sit down.
Well, I mean, the delegation of Ukraine had like a 6 or 7, almost 7 hours conversation with Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner before they flew to Moscow. And I can assure you that not too many topics were discussed. It was mostly the discussion about the territorial issue, the existing line to stop, and the narrative and the wordings around the territorial issues in the plan. So I don't think that we really have to count by hours, but still, I'm confident that American representative had the full knowledge and full understanding from Ukrainian side, and he was doing his best, I hope, and we hope, to give us some insights whether there is an intention to negotiate anything at all, and we will be able to hear about that shortly.
What do you think is the main sticking point in those negotiations? Because there's two major ones, I'd say. The territorial concessions. Ukraine would like to freeze the lines as they are today. Europe would like the same. And Russia would like Ukraine to give up the two oblasts, Donbas, Donetsk and Luhansk, so the Donbas. And the other one is for Ukraine to enshrine in its constitution that it will not join NATO, the opposite of what's currently in the constitution. So are these the two sticking points? And out of these two, which one do you say is the most difficult one to solve?
Well, I would say that generally building the narrative around these 2 points is the tactics of negotiations, right, that we are trying to explore together with American allies. So this is the first time that that Russian side has provided their wish list in 28 points, and it has been narrowed to 20 points. And now on this basis, a discussion on the pending issues is taking place. So that's why, commenting on any of these points is not making sense, because basically it is what Russian side communicates to American side, that it's about Donbas, but at the same time Russian government dedicates like millions, dozens of millions of US dollars to educate its youth, including Ukrainian children on the occupied territories, that this is a war against NATO and the United States. So we have a lot of kids who are coming back to Ukraine. They were simply testifying and speaking about the narratives which were poured in their ears, and these are different. So I don't think that we really have to think that it's about only Donbas. This is how Russia is building dialogue right now. We are very vocal, and we said it clear that we are ready to stop on the existing line. We're ready to discuss about the ceasefire, and we are ready to make a multi-layer solution, whereas we're stopping the active war period right now, and then we're working on the security guarantees, building the deterrence, and then afterwards, we're speaking about, more about the root causes and the next steps to that. So I think this is what comes to the territory. But what about the membership in NATO? I think at some point having security guarantee from the United States on the Article 5 like format is not less powerful than being a member of NATO, because if we will recall different military operations American government, American military were conducting throughout the years in different parts of the world, they never did it by themselves. They always engaged with different allied forces, be it like Netherlands, be it Great Britain, be it France. So basically security guarantees could be equalized to a NATO membership if we will get closer to the deal.
Yeah, exactly. I had a debate with other guests, is that if Ukraine does get security guarantees, it's essentially just almost the same as joining NATO. So if NATO is that big of an issue, then why would Russia be even open to discussing security guarantees? I want to go to I've got another interesting question here. Is what are your thoughts on Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner leading those negotiations? You know, these are two business people, very astute business people, but business people nonetheless, instead of having seasoned diplomats. What do you make of this? And do you think it's a good thing having business people negotiate an end to the war and looking at it from a business lens?
Well, I can't say that it's only Steve Witkoff, a special envoy of the president. He has the full mandate to negotiate what he negotiates right now. But also, we have a Secretary Rubio who was in Florida last week, who supervised the dialogue and who have been shaping it from the, State Department point of view. Also, Daniel Driscoll has been very much engaged into the process. He was in Kiev, he was in Geneva. He has this military angle, and we also have other people in the team like Andy Baker, for example, who is also assembling the topic. So it's not only the special envoy and president, but for this particular period of time, when it's about Ukrainian to American delegation, American to Russian delegation, and when it's about the plan and narrowing the discussion to let's say territorial issue, this is where he has his role. But when we're coming closer to a, let's say, more significant parts of that, all the other players would be around that. But I can tell you that it's an interesting approach, and I think we should give every approach a chance, because I mean, nobody in the whole world invented a miraculous way to end this war in 3.5 years, and we should give it a try, having the commitment of the President of the United States, the Vice President of the United States, the Secretary of State, the Special Envoy, which is one of the well-known allies for President Trump. We have a bipartisan backup from the Congress and Senate, and I think we should give a try to every format and every chance which could lead us to ending the war.
How do you compare the approach by, let's say, Witkoff and Rubio in trying to reach some sort of resolution?
Could you repeat, please?
How do you compare the tactics that are used by Rubio and Witkoff? What would you make of each of them? And what are the differences and similarities, and which one do you think works better in these circumstances?
Well, I don't think it's a particularly very correct things I can comment as an ambassador of Ukraine to the United States, but I think the nature of their engagement is different. Secretary Rubio is coordinating his efforts also and talking to European allies and to NATO Secretary General and to a wider group of people. He has a formal mandate, and Steve Witkoff is a person who has this way of talking to the Russians using different lines of contacts. So whatever is agreed or discussed at the level of the special presidential envoy, of course, needs to be then formalized at the level of the Secretary of State and higher, and to be endorsed by the president. So I think these are not different lines, but they're just the sequences of steps and engagements. And I think at this point, starting from Geneva, we see that this is a well-structured process on both sides.
Have you seen the leaks of the discussion, Witkoff discussing Ukraine plans with the Putin aide? I can't remember what the transcript said, but they came out a few days ago, where Steve Witkoff was talking to Yuri, telling him, talking to him about how there is Yuri saying, yes, that's why we suspend the organization of First Russian Arabic Summit. Witkoff says yes, and Yuri says, we think you're making a real job there in the region. And then Witkoff says, well, listen, I'm going to tell you something. I think we can get the Russia-Ukraine thing solved. Everybody's jumping for joy. And they talk about how to present it to the president. I'm not sure if you've seen that transcript. I'm not going to read it all now. Your thoughts on that relationship? Because and a lot of people are using it to kind of position Witkoff as someone being more on the Russian side, and even saying that the 28-point peace plan was written by Russia. Do you think that's a fair characterization?
Well, of course, I have a little bit more background on that it was publicly available. But maybe commenting on this issue, I would just bring your attention to something which was not discussed publicly. Basically, if you will read this transcript, you will see that the only thing Ushakov actually wanted is to have a phone call of his president with President Trump ahead of the meeting with Zelenskyy. He never commented on anything else in this transcript. This is the only thing he wanted, and he got it. And he really and this call played a disruptive role, just like less than 24 hours ahead of the meeting with President Trump with President Zelenskyy. So this is like a water talking to a sand. The goal of Steve Witkoff was perfectly clear, just to have sort of a vision from the Russian side on a paper. What is that actually they want to have and see as a solution. But on the Russian side, nobody really cared about that. The only thing they wanted is to have a call to undermine whatever was planned and agreed by Ukrainian delegation for this meeting on Friday. And he basically partially succeeded that.
Yeah, I think a lot of people are criticizing Witkoff, Rubio, Kushner on the progress. But like, if you compare where we are now to where we were a year ago, when Putin was completely alienated, there's no even discussions about a peace deal. Anyone that even hinted about a meeting with Putin was seen as a traitor. So it's just a massive shift in the administration's stance. And I think it's fair to say we're still far from peace, but at least we can say we're closer than we've ever been since the war began. Now, I want to ask you something. In the last discussion we had a debate at the end, me and you, on how big of a role NATO's expansion had on the invasion in 2022. And you were making the argument that it played a minuscule role, if at all. But if that's the case, why is one of the core points in the 28-point peace plan, again, as I said earlier, for Ukraine to enshrine in its constitution that it will not join NATO? If this is not a concern for Russia, why add it as such a pillar of the peace plan?
Because it justifies every action President Putin has been taking since the beginning of war, since the beginning of the full-scale invasion in front of his own population and his own businesses and oligarchs who face sanctions, frozen assets, and anything else. So, and basically, it is for free for him. So he turns back and says, here is the goal I had for like 30 years, and I finally reached that. And that nobody's really putting a question whether you had to start a war. Nobody's putting a question whether this aggression was needed. Nobody's putting any questions, because then you just legalize everything you were doing. So this is for us something that sounds like this, and in fact it has led to opposite. Of course, Ukraine is not a member of NATO, but just since the beginning of the full-scale aggression, we are fully operating by NATO standards, using American and European allied weapons, but also we have been the major source of innovation and expertise for NATO. And this would never happen if Russia would not invade into Ukraine. So if, like, looking back into the reality, every goal decreed by Russians have reached the opposite result.
I want to ask you a bit of a tough question again. And you're free to answer it as the ambassador, or if you want to answer it more on a personal level. It's a 28-point peace plan that was presented to Ukraine, that was cut down by Ukraine to about 19 points, and was cut down by Europe. So there's a few peace plans floating around. But I'm going to mention a few points. I want to ask you, similar to what I asked earlier, which one of these points would you personally consider to be non-negotiable? One of them, freezing the lines, the lines where they are today, in terms of Lugansk under Russian control, Donetsk about 80%, whatever, under Russian control, and the rest about 60%, Zaporizhia, Kherson about 60%, versus giving up the Donbas. So that's one of the big points of disagreement. The other one about joining NATO. The other one about limitations to the Ukrainian military. I'd say these 3 points I want to ask you about. Which of these 3 points would you, Madam Ambassador, consider non-negotiable no matter what.
Yeah, of course, I understand that you're expecting a sensational, sensational out of that. But I would put it this way: I will take the territorial point aside, and I think that on a principle note, nothing that is really goes in contradiction with the sovereignty and the sovereign functioning of a state as a sovereign state should be negotiated. Speaking about the Ukraine's membership to EU or Ukraine's membership to NATO or the cap on the scope of the armed forces. This is not something that could be put on with the equal side to sovereignty. So I think this is not something that is worth of looking into on a positive way. But I would say for me as a Ukrainian, and that I've spent all of these years in Ukraine with my family, and I saw all the atrocities of war after Ukrainian armed forces were able to deoccupy significant parts of Ukraine, like in Kharkiv region, in Izum, and other things. We saw a lot of things happening in Mariupol, but also in Kiev region. And I think the ability for all Ukrainians to leave the territories if there is a ceasefire unconditionally is vital, but also the return of all abducted children of Ukraine unconditionally is also something that could not be negotiated. Other than that, it will not be a territorial ceasefire solution. It will be pardoning the killer.
Understood. Talking about progress that Ukraine had a couple of years ago in regaining territory by Russia, at the moment, Russia's having progress on the ground, incremental, but progress nonetheless. The most notable one is Pokrovsk. Putin said it already is under Russian control, but there's no way to verify that. And Pokrovsk is not the only city. What do you make of these Russian advances?
Well, unfortunately, I have to say that basically this is the way Russian political leadership is talking to American government. By, let's say, building a narrative around Pokrovsk. Pokrovsk is the very hot spot on a battlefield, but in course of 1 week, we have around 1,000 combat engagements across all the line, and Pokrovsk is one of these areas. So the narrative Russians are building around that this is the bottle of the bottles, right? Just to pour this narrative that they're succeeding. They are trying hard. They're in real military agony, throwing all the forces and all the capabilities they have to attack Ukrainian cities, to demoralize population, to destroy Ukrainian energy infrastructure. So, but mostly for us, it looks like a military agony and playing with muscles in light of the different engagements with the American government when it comes to ending the war. So they're just trying to speculate with this intention of President Trump to end the war. And I think they're doing it the way they can, and they're just using human lives and their war machine for that.
But we do know that there is progress on Pokrovsk. Whether it's fallen or not, it's hard to verify. Reuters saying there's reporting restrictions in being able to enter Pokrovsk and verify. I think there's restrictions on the Ukrainian side as well to be able to verify this information. But everyone agrees, including people that are very pro-Ukrainian. They've got YouTube channels that talk about the atrocities that Russia's committed, and they admit that Pokrovsk either has fallen or is about to fall. Now, I do want to say that there have been talks about Pokrovsk falling for over a year now, but it seems that it's inevitable today. And Pokrovsk is, or at least was, a logistics hub in the Donetsk region, and the last major city before the final belt of defense cities in the Donbas. So my question to you is, how big of a problem this will cause Ukraine in the negotiations, as it is changing the narrative? Everyone now is talking about Russian advances, when a year ago, 6 to 12 months ago, people were talking about how Russia's losing, facing a lot of casualties and barely moving the battlefield lines.
Well, I think that for everybody who cares about their lives and their families in Ukraine, everybody understand that the ceasefire is something that really is time for. And we are able to defend ourselves, and we will be able to defend ourselves, and we are standing and will be standing. But eventually, every war ends up with a deal. But at the same time, it's not only in Ukraine; it's also here in the United States. Is decided by which price this deal will be brought to the table.
What worries me, though, is if Pokrovsk is falling, um, Trump wants to reach a peace deal. Just another peace deal today. There was a press conference with Rwanda and Congo, which I've been very involved in, and Trump was announcing how and getting credit for reaching a peace deal in that region. So Trump wants to put another peace deal in his pocket. He wants this to end. There's been a lot of reports about how Trump is just fed up of this. He's fed up of discussing the battlefield lines. And then you add to this Macron's concerns. There was a leaked call between European leaders and Macron, where Macron said, quote, there is a possibility that the US will betray Ukraine on the issue of territory without clarity on security guarantees. And then you got Chancellor Merz saying, telling Zelenskyy, I think they are playing games both with you and with us. And lastly, Finland's president says, quote, we cannot leave Ukraine and Zelenskyy alone with these guys. So if you put all these together, it looks like Ukraine is in a weaker position than probably it's been since the beginning of the war almost, or at least since it's had its successful counterattack in 2022. Would love to get your thoughts on this. Fall of Pokrovsk, Trump wanting to end this quickly to get another win in his pocket, under his belt, and the leaked calls of European leaders that are concerned that the US will betray them and betray Ukraine.
Well, according to our military, the situation in Pokrovsk will not have a fundamental and decisive effect to a general dynamics on the front line. So this is what I can say, and I'm of course not a military expert on that. And this would not have a dramatic effect on the ongoing negotiations right now. Also about the statement of President Trump. I can perfectly understand him. He's presenting a country which does not have a war on his territory, and he has never had this, military background or, a political background even before his first presidency. And I can only understand and imagine how complicated it is for him, because we have spent years at war. We never won it. We never chosen. We never provoked, and never even started to think about. So I understand that, but still the war is raging on, and as long as it is raging on in Ukraine, this will be part of American politics, unfortunately, because this is not only about the territorial issue, about so many more things. This is about Europe, about relations of America with Europe, about what is like the stand of America in international arena. Ukraine will always be part of the agenda. So it is like, I think, our bilateral interest to end the war in a way that it will not be starting again, that it will be just, and it will give a clarity and security for Europe, and will take this topic away from the top of American policy. About the leak,
yes.
I would say that I'd rather hear the comment from the U.S. government on that. I don't think that anybody from Ukrainian side should make the comment on that.
Do you worry that the U.S. could betray Ukraine? I'm not saying they are betraying, but is that a worry that you sometimes have? Based on
we don't have any for every Ukrainian, the best thing in the world is to wake up in the morning. So the expectations of Ukrainians are not that high to anyone. So we're using every instrument which is at our disposal to minimize our losses and to help us to survive through the war and through the winter, and to end the war. And as long as this vehicle is running, we're riding together. So, but we are prepared for anything.
Another thing that people expect is not for Trump to betray Ukraine or the US to betray Ukraine, but to do the opposite. So what we saw after the Alaska meeting, Trump took a bit of a U-turn, or a significant U-turn, started criticizing Putin, supporting Zelenskyy, made comments or a Truth Social post saying Ukraine could regain their territory and even go beyond their territory, because the meeting with Putin didn't go too well. Trump was pretty pissed off about it. And then what Trump authorized is he's approved U.S. intelligence capabilities to be used by Ukraine for their long-range strikes into Russia. It's a very significant development. Started talking about the supply of Tomahawk missiles. And of course, the most significant development of the sanctions on Lukoil and Rosneft. So my first question to you is, could we see the same thing again here, where Trump, if he sees Putin very stubborn in his positions and not willing to meet Ukraine halfway, start using the stick again and increasing sanctions on Russia or increasing military support for Ukraine? Are you aware of any such discussions, or would you say that's a possibility that we could see if those negotiations don't bear fruit?
Well, what I see is a strong bipartisan support, both at the Senate and the House, and the real commitment and intention to push through the legislation on sanctions and recognition of Russia as a sponsor of terrorism. But I don't have much hope to see another surge in putting pressure on Russia from the United States. So I don't see any preconditions which could really give us the signal that there is a commitment, because Russia, they play these delay tactics, just saying, okay, we're committed to dialogue, but we're not ready to take a decision. Let's just take another step. They're not in a hurry. They don't have the war on their territory, you know. They're sending Russians to die outside the territory of Russia, so that nobody sees that, and they don't have the problems the regular democracies have, so they can take as much time as they can, as long as China, North Korea, and Iran giving them a backup, and as long as the American leadership is investing his personal time in negotiating with Russia and subjectivizing them on the arena. So he has as much time as he wants, but we do not have it. We're losing a lot of lives.
Okay, on that point, you said Putin has as much time as he wants. Does that mean the sanctions are not really working? Because if the sanctions are working, that will be hitting his coffers and hitting his oil revenue. Do you think he's able to avoid them again? The Rosneft and Lukoil sanctions through his shadow fleet? Is that why Ukraine is striking those shadow fleet vessels? They struck 2, potentially 3.
Well, as long as it is a legal action and it was not enforced immediately, it gave a period of time for adjustments. So I think there's nobody more sophisticated in the whole world in bypassing sanctions. For years, Russians were using the inability for European countries and also American government to enforce sanctions properly. So impose sanctions is one thing, but enforce them is a different thing. So they are absolutely skillful in that. But destroying the infrastructure, which is the fuel or blood of war, if I may say so, is different. This is something that is immediately enforceable.
Yeah, so one would look at Ukraine's strategy of striking the Russian shadow fleet vessels as a smart strategy, because that's what's funding, the main source of revenue for Putin to continue funding the war. But everyone worries about what the response from Russia would be. I think Putin did threaten to landlock Ukraine and start striking Ukrainian vessels, which would impact food prices globally, including especially in Africa, and obviously impact Ukraine's economy, which is struggling at the moment. Is that a strategy by Ukraine now to continue striking the vessels? And do you worry about what the Russian repercussions would be?
Yeah, we're striking infrastructure. This is different, I would say, but I think it's a perfectly legitimate targeting, because we're attacking the military infrastructure, but also the energy infrastructure, because it's a public document, and it's written in the Russian war or military or defense doctrine that the gas is the major instrument of geopolitical influence, and now is the major instrument of war. So, and it's not a secret to anyone. So this is the tactics which have so far been successful. visible. And I think what is worth really mentioning that the targeting is never been directed to attack civilians, to attack people, to attack kindergartens or whatever. So the goals are the targets are purely military ones. So I think this is very important, just also for you to hear, because there could be a speculation saying, okay, then Russians are attacking as well, but they're not attacking a lot of energy infrastructure, although they do it, but they are mostly attacking houses, households. They attack theaters, they attack kindergartens, they attack public places, just to have this demoralizing effect to population. And this is what speaks for the nature of their aggression.
So the last thing I want to ask you about is a development that when I read it, it was, I'm not Ukrainian and it got me sick to my stomach. While Ukrainians are struggling to get electricity, struggling to cope with this war, you've got people high up close to Zelenskyy that are allegedly part of a pretty significant corruption scheme. I would love you, and now that's reached Zelensky's top aide, his friend, his partner, Andriy Yermak. Can you give the audience an overview of what we know so far about these allegations and your response to them?
Well, there's of course, a wider context to that. So first and foremost, I would say that this has already happened. And first, this was a Ukrainian institutions created by Ukrainian parliament and the government who conducted the investigation and exposed this information. I think that is, at this point, we can also draw some conclusions out of it. And my president has not only had the public reaction, he also requested the retirement of the members of government who were publicly accused of this as part of the scandal. He also demanded the court hearing and the convictions, but also as an element of domestic pressure, he has made a decision which was of particular complexity to him. It was really not an easy solution for him personally to accept the retiring request from his former chief of office, Andriy Yermak, so very well-known person in this audience, and he has been his right hand throughout the full 5 years, including every day of the war. So I think at this point, the reaction of my president, beyond having his mandate, was very personal, and I think his commitment is very clear. He also thought that in case any other materials will be exposed, so the decision of the same nature will follow. So at this point, I think it's very important that all the other institutions just do their job and follow the procedures and the mandates they are given. So it's a domestic issue. It caused a lot of discussions in a society. It's absolutely unfair that this has happened just ahead of the beginning of the winter season, when really people are suffering, as you're saying. This is so unfair, and everybody hated to see it, hated to hear it. But at the same time, it was not something that was applied to everybody. The reactions were taken. People retired. The state institutions are relaunched. The process at least started, and the convictions to follow. So I think nobody really happy with this. Absolutely. But we did what we could.
I don't blame you for being upset by this. If I was Ukrainian, I'll be fuming right now. But it's not just a corruption scandal. The amount of money is insane, but also the people involved. Again, Yermak was seen as the second most powerful person in Ukraine. He's been, I think, a childhood friend to Zelenskyy. He's seen as a deputy president, seen by many. He served as the head of the office of the president, the chief of staff, for many years. And you've also got the report by Fox News where Timur allegedly had an apartment with golden toilets that was in the same building as Zelenskyy. And that's according to a former Ukrainian official that was speaking to Fox News. I don't know if that's true or not, if that's been verified, if you know more about it.
No.
Okay, that's not true?
No, many things are not really correct. I can comment on
please,
that.
yes. So the golden toilet, obviously Andriy Yermak's a potential involvement is true. He's being investigated, and he has been let go by Zelenskyy, and I think he's been sent to the front line. But the golden toilets, I think, is the one you smiled at. So you're saying that's not true?
Yeah, somebody had a golden toilet, but it's not related to government of President Zelensky. And also,
But was it
his former chief of
Timur? Sorry to interrupt you. Was it Timur that had the golden
yeah.
toilets, who's a business partner of Zelensky?
Yeah, he's a former business partner, and he's now subjected to sanctions. And I mean, there are some photos in the media, so I cannot. I was obviously not very much interested in inquiring whether it's his toilet or not. So maybe you can conduct a little bit of investigation and come back to me on this issue. But at the same time, I want to bring a little bit of clarity. So. Our National Anti-Corruption Bureau has conducted searches in the apartment of former President's Chief of Office, Andrei Yermak, but he's not incriminated with any crime or unconvicted of something. So this is a very important element. But the public pressure and the public attention around this issue was so high that this decision was taken. But from the legal and formal point of view, he's not convicted of anything. He's not filed any procedural appeal from the prosecutor.
Innocent until proven guilty.
Exactly.
How likely? This is probably the last question and the toughest one. How likely do you think it is that President Zelensky was involved?
Absolutely not. Absolutely. I know him from the 5 years of being in a government, and definitely the last thing I could think of him is him messing around this thing. But still, I think we have all learned our lesson. We have learned our lesson, because this was not only about Yermak. This were two members of the government and one other former member of the government whose names are being part of that. And it also gave us the lesson that even when the war is raging on, you cannot turn a blind eye on things which are happening in any area. So I think now the instructions from president to the government is just to have a full control of the situation, full control of the energy sector, and making sure that all the commitments and expectations of people are met. And we will see how that works.
The silver lining in that corruption scandal is that, the corruption is horrible, but the worst thing is corruption that no one talks about and no one confronts. The second worst thing is corruption that is at least exposed, which is what we have here. So the positive development here is a Ukrainian organization, National Anti-Corruption Bureau of Ukraine, that was set up many years ago, is the organization, the body, the independent body, at least independent for now. I know under Zelensky a while ago, it was almost no longer independent. Glad that didn't happen. But the independent anti-corruption body is the organization that was able to dig out the scandal that we're seeing. So that's a positive development there. We'll get more information as it comes out. Madam Ambassador, absolute pleasure as always. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you, Mario. And I'm waiting for you in Washington.
I'd love to meet you. Maybe we should meet in Ukraine.
Yeah, agreed. Yeah, thank you. Thank you. Bye.